Imagine walking through a city where the very ground beneath your feet is hiding a secret. A sprawling network of tunnels, once dug to build Paris, but later filled with the dead. What started as a solution to a collapsing city quickly became one of history's most eerie underground monuments. But how did these quarries go from a source of life to a final resting place for the dead? This is The Resurrectionists. Hello everybody and welcome to episode 9 of The Resurrectionists podcast. It is officially the second to last episode of the podcast. I am very excited to be getting my weekends back. Not that this hasn't been fun, but the stress is starting to get to me, especially last week when I was in Paris for the day, which was the inspiration behind today's episode. I just want to say, if there is any weird howling sort of background noise, no, my house is not haunted. Well, I'm not going to say that, but to my knowledge, my house is not haunted, but there is a lot of wind outside, and I can't control that, so sorry about that. Actually, my friend Eva is convinced that I am haunted and that I took home a ghost from the Catacombs because when we were going through the automated passport control, whatever, on the way back, it kept telling me to go back and try again because only one person is allowed in the thingy at the one time. I was only one person. I did not have a big bag on me. I'm convinced computers can sense ghosts, so yeah, I definitely brought home a ghost from the Catacombs, but they haven't done anything yet, so I'm sure they're super friendly. So yes, this week we will be discussing the Catacombs of Paris, or, hang on, let me try my 6 years of leaving cert French here. Les Catacombs de Paris. I failed French, in case that wasn't obvious. So yes, I was in Paris last week and I actually went to the Catacombs. That was the whole reason I went to Paris and dragged 2 of my oldest and dearest friends with me. Literally just went for the day. Woke up at 2 a.m. in the morning to go to Paris for the day and went to sleep at 1 a.m. Work was fun on Monday. If you're gonna do that, don't go on a Sunday, is my advice. But do it, because the flight was only like €40 return, and it was worth it, because staying the night in Paris is damn expensive, but you can get a lot done in a day. So that's my holiday recommendation in this morbid archaeology and history podcast. Go to Paris for the day. If you live in Europe, if you live in America, maybe, I don't know, go for a few days. So, without any further ado, Les Catacombs de Paris. Again, failed French. So initially, the tunnels underground Paris, as I mentioned in the introduction, were dug as quarries to help build Paris, specifically limestone, gypsum, clay, and sand, but more specifically limestone, were quarried out of the quarries and taken up into the city to help build most of the structures and stuff that were in Old Paris. Most notably, Notre Dame was built using materials mined from the quarries beneath the city of Paris. So logistically, this actually made a lot of sense because it meant that they didn't have to move a lot of raw material from the quarries into the cities. They could just mine it all in the city, move it up, and then only have to move it a short distance to wherever they were using the materials. So the quarrying was thought to have begun around the 12th century and went on until around the 1700s. During this time, around 200 miles of tunnels were dug beneath Paris. However, in 1774, there was a particularly catastrophic collapse where one of the tunnels collapsed in on itself, taking down an entire city street, including numerous buildings, killed and injured many people. And it was at this point that the Parisians and the government and king at the time began to realize what a problem it was that they had been quarrying under their city and building big damn-ass churches on top of their now structurally unsound city. I am not a geologist, nor an architect, but even I can tell you, that's kind of dumb. So in 1777, a quarry inspectorate was commissioned, so a kind of group, I guess, was commissioned by King Louis to explore, survey, and reinforce the underground tunnels. Now, the 1774 collapse wasn't the only one. It was just kind of the big one that made them realize what a problem they had going on in the city. There were numerous smaller collapses around this time as well. And when the quarry inspectorate went down into the tunnels, they started exploring them, and they also started connecting a lot of the disconjointed tunnels, which of course meant more digging. And when I heard that, I thought, why? That seems stupid. Your city is already sinking. But hey, what do I know? So because of the issue of the city sinking, it meant that a lot of tall and heavy buildings couldn't be built, and therefore the city couldn't grow upwardly and instead had to grow outwardly to accommodate people who were living there. So Paris sort of became a more of a sprawled out city rather than a tall city, if that makes sense. So around the same time, there was also instances of bubonic plague and smallpox epidemics that were going across Paris and France, and this led to a lot of overcrowding in the cemeteries in the city, particularly of the Cemetery of the Innocents, or Les Innocents. Again, I failed French. So this led to a lot of overcrowding problems in the cemetery, which led to other problems as well. There is records of sort of horrific stenches and odors coming out of the cemeteries, specifically Cemetery of the Innocents. And I think in one case there might have even been a collapse at one point where a lot of the bodies ended up getting exposed as well. So in 1785, King Louis XVI set out an ordinance, or sort of proclaimed that they had to stop using the Cemetery of the Innocents and find something to do with the remains of the people who were there, and potentially remains of more individuals who would die after this point as well. And so two of Paris's largest problems sort of ended up helping each other out. They had networks of tunnels beneath the city that were causing the city to collapse and needed infilling, and they had a load of human remains that they didn't know what to do with. And so in December 1785, they began to dig up and move individuals from the Cemetery of the Innocents into the tunnels beneath the city. Now, these people were usually dug up in the middle of the night, put into carts, moved to sort of holes in the ground, essentially, that they had above the tunnels, dropped down into these holes. There was no attempts made to keep individuals, their body parts or their bones together. They were just trying to move out as many human remains from the cemetery as they could and get them down the shafts into the tunnels. Now, while this was taking place in the middle of the night, usually people did know that it was going on. There's tales of people watching from windows or from street view of this kind of mass excavation and evacuation, I guess maybe, of remains from the cemeteries into the tunnels. The hope was that they could use the remains to fill up the hollow spaces in the tunnels left by the quarrying, and therefore stop the tunnels from collapsing in on themselves. So during this transfer, a lot of the remains were damaged or lost. A lot of them became even more damaged when they were thrown down the shafts, and then they were just sort of left in piles in these tunnels beneath the city. So all in all, it's thought that around 6 million individuals were deposited into these tunnels, and they could date as far back as the 15th century. The area was consecrated on April 7th, 1786, and designated the Paris Municipal Ossuary. So over time, different columns and plaques, paintings, essentially just different architectural artistic features, memorial features have been added to the catacombs. The most notable one is at the 14th arrondissement, which is the now public entrance to the catacombs. When you go from the tunnel part of the catacombs into the ossuary part, the part with the human remains, you go through a doorway, and above that doorway is a quote from Virgil's Aeneid. They have it in French, obviously, but it translates to "Halt, here is the empire of the dead." So sort of a reminder that you are now entering the realm of the dead, so to speak. So like I said, initially when they placed the remains into the catacombs, they just sort of threw them down the shafts and piled them up in the tunnels. However, in the early 1800s, it was organized or reorganized by Inspector Reichert de Thury, I failed French, using a museographical and monumental approach. So, I don't know, if you do museum studies, maybe you know what that means, but I don't. So they took the bones that had previously been loosely piled up, and they tried to organize them into sort of walls. They used the same system that the quarrying had tried to use to sort of backfill some of the areas back in the day, except they used it with human remains. So they would build walls using the femurs and the tibias and alternating them with skulls. Femurs and tibias are two of the longest and thickest of the long bones. So it would make sense that they would be more structurally sound, I guess, than any of the other bones. And then they alternated these with skulls to sort of build walls. And then they piled the remaining bones behind the walls. So what you see now today when you go visit the catacombs is you'll see the ends or the tops of femurs and tibias, and then you'll see the skulls sticking out sort of between them. And then you don't really see the rest of the bones in the human body because they are piled up behind them. You see some of them on the top, but obviously the ones on the top have been subjected to more damage over the years. So it is harder to make them out, or they're just not as recognizable, I suppose, as they used to be. They also started adding in some design choices, I guess, when they were building these walls as well. In some of them, they've laid the skulls out in the shapes of hearts, or they've laid the skulls out in the shapes of columns, or they just started taking some artistic liberties, I guess, with their walls of human remains. It's very strange to use human remains to build supporting structures. I don't know. It's weird. This whole thing's weird, but fascinating. So in 1809, the catacombs officially opened to the public, which I guess, now that you think about it, makes sense. But when I initially heard that, I was like, oh wow, it's way older as a tourist destination than I thought. But I guess it wasn't initially opened as a tourist destination. It was more opened as well, this is where your dead people are now. Can't guarantee that's Grandpa, but he's in here somewhere. Probably. Unless we lost him on the way. And they continued to bury remains in the catacombs until 1860. So at the moment, only 2 kilometers of the catacombs are open to the public, but it's estimated that they have approximately 550,000 visitors a year to the catacombs. And I can contest that getting a ticket to the catacombs is kind of difficult. It's not really difficult. It's just the last time I went to France before this time, I didn't realize how far in advance you have to book a ticket, and I didn't get to see the catacombs, which was sad. But if you do want to go, tickets go on sale 7 days in advance, and I would suggest getting them 7 days in advance. It's not a fight to get tickets. Like, you don't have to be there at like 12 a.m. on Friday night to like get your tickets. Like, they'll be there later on in the day, but also don't go on a Saturday expecting to get in by buying a ticket there, because you won't. Tickets usually do sell out a couple of days before. So while the catacombs are a tourist destination, and while parts of the catacombs are open to the public, there are also many parts of the catacombs that are not open to the public. However, this doesn't stop people from going in and visiting on occasion. Particularly, there have been concerts and different events held in the catacombs illegally, of course. Most notably, the largest illegal concert held in the catacombs was held for around 100 scholars in 1897. They played different music, and interestingly enough, the theme tune to this podcast, which is called Dance Macabre, was played in that illegal concert. And when you do the tour of the catacombs, they give you a little audio guide included in your ticket price, and they played some of the songs that were played, and they played our little theme tune as well. So that was fun when I was there. It's also thought that different secret societies used to meet up in the catacombs as well. No confirmation on this, of course. Number one rule of secret society is that you don't talk about secret society, but you do apparently leave your secret society marks in the catacombs. I don't know how smart that is, so I don't know how accurate it is that that's what people were actually doing versus just graffitiing the catacombs. But it is part of the lore of the catacombs that it was a meeting place for secret societies. So one of the things I was interested in while visiting the catacombs was if there was any research that had been done into the remains that are there. Now, these remains are all highly disarticulated, and therefore studying them would be somewhat difficult, I suppose, or you'd be limited in what you could study. Specifically, I would think the easiest thing would be to study anything that's visible on the skulls, because the skulls are easier to count the minimum number of individuals. An individual can only have one skull, let's say, and they're kind of the most recognizable thing for there to be disease on, let's say. That is to say that pathology you see on the skull can tend to be more indicative of a specific disease, versus pathologies you're seeing on long bones could be indicative of multiple diseases, and you'd normally need more of the skeleton to narrow down the possibility of what was causing that particular pathology, if that makes sense. So I was thinking that the skulls would be, or that pathologies that appear on skulls would be the easiest thing to study, and it appears that is the way from the research I have been able to do on this. I was, while I was there, looking at the different skulls and trying to find anything that my friends would find interesting. I didn't find any syphilis, which was funny, because that's what I was looking out for mostly, was syphilis. It's just one of the more recognizable ones in the skull. Didn't find any though. Apparently there is syphilis in the catacombs though. In the skeletons. In the skeletons in the catacombs. Anyway. So I did find one research paper that studied the prevalence of leprosy in the individuals from the catacombs. So we're going to talk about that one. But leprosy infects the nasal passages and the palate. It causes the collapsing of the bridge of the nose, absorption of the middle part of the maxilla, inflammation on the floor and sides of the nasal cavity and the hard palate, and ultimately it can lead to perforation of the palate. So if you only have a skull to look at and you're trying to determine if an individual had leprosy, you're usually looking for damage around the nasal area and the maxilla, which is the top part of your teeth and kind of up into your facial bit. A bit is kind of hard to describe. Anyway, so that's kind of the area you're looking at to try and determine if an individual possibly had leprosy. Leprosy is thought to have been endemic in Paris from between the Gallo-Roman era to the 15th century. And we do know there are historical records that say that there are at least 2 individuals who were infected with leprosy that ended up in the catacombs from St. Laurent's leprosy hospital. So there are 2 known individuals in the catacombs. Obviously, they don't know where they are anymore, but they do know for certain that 2 individuals in the catacombs had leprosy. So they ended up studying 123 continuous sections of catacombs walls, and these ones are thought to date to between the 18th and the 19th century. So after the period where leprosy was thought to be sort of endemic in France, but it's still thought that leprosy may have been in the population, just not to the same extent. So in the sections that they studied, there were 1,500 skulls. Of those, 133 were deemed not to be in suitable condition to study, and so that left 367 that could be studied. Of these, 74 had central bone differences and were studied more in depth. 29 of these were determined to be female, 35 male, and 10 indeterminate. Of these 74, 2 were determined to have probable leprosy, meaning they met 3 out of 3 criteria. 21 were determined to have possible leprosy, meaning they met at least 1 out of 3 criteria. And 51 were determined not to have leprosy because they met 0 out of 3 criteria, or not to have visible signs of leprosy on the bone. As with all diseases, they don't always affect the bone, and even if the disease itself could affect the bone, like in the case of leprosy, it doesn't always live long enough in the individual, or the individual doesn't always live long enough for the disease to affect their bones. So when we're talking about it here, we're just talking about the individuals who showed signs of leprosy. This is not necessarily all individuals who had leprosy. So while examining these remains, they also noted some other pathologies that they saw, which included dental abscesses, bone cysts, bone tumors, tertiary syphilis, and trepanations. So there is syphilis. I just didn't see any. I think I did see a bone cyst, or possibly a bone cyst. I think I might have seen a bone cyst on one of the skulls. So like I said, these skulls are kind of from the more modern 18th to 19th century section of the catacombs, and so they're not from the period where leprosy would have been more prominent in the population, so that might be why they're seeing such low levels of leprosy in these individuals. The older skulls are more or are less accessible and less well preserved, so it is more difficult to study these ones, hence why these 18th to 19th century skulls were used. Also, like I mentioned before, they're only looking at the skulls here, so other bones that might show signs of leprosy they're not looking at, and therefore if an individual wasn't showing signs of leprosy in their skull but was showing signs of leprosy in other bones, let's say their hands or their feet, then they can't see that because they don't have the hands or the feet. So this is just kind of one study and an example of the kinds of studies that can be done given the condition of the bones. And I just kind of want to highlight that to say, like, they are studying the bones at the catacombs. It's just kind of limiting as to what they can do. I actually came across a newspaper article yesterday night while I was scrolling on my phone that literally at the time of recording this came out like 24 hours ago. And it was talking about Philippe Charlier. I don't know. He's the guy who did this leprosy study and is currently working with teams of students from universities in Paris in the catacombs to do further studies on the remains. Some of the walls in the catacombs have collapsed due to water getting in, I think. And so they have to take the walls apart to help build them back up again. They were actually doing this work while I was there, so you could see they had these bags and bags of bones that they'd taken out of the walls to then try and build them back up again and make them more structurally sound. So they have invited the universities in to study the remains while they have them taken out of the walls and before they put them back in, because this previous study on leprosy was done with the skulls in situ, so in place. They couldn't take them out and examine them more closely, so that limits even more what they are able to study. But with this reconstruction work going on, it's meant that they have more access to the remains and they've been able to study them. However, the article also states that this research could go on for decades because there are so many remains in the catacombs that you probably never be able to study all of them or never run out of things to study. I believe they're also attempting to do some ADNA research onto them. I'm not sure. It didn't really say if this ADNA research was specifically to look at the individual's DNA or to look for disease information. You can use ADNA to look into what diseases an individual might have had that wouldn't have shown up on their bones. So leprosy, tuberculosis, syphilis, no, not polio, cholera, I think, perhaps. There's other ones, I just can't remember what they are, but you can use ADNA to study them. It's something I'm interested in, but I don't really know anything about it. I'm trying to learn more about it, but I do find it interesting. So I think that's what they're doing with the ADNA research, not necessarily trying to determine any sort of relationship between individuals, if that makes sense. So there was also one other study I found that I could only read the abstract for because I didn't have access to the whole thing, but it was a very detailed abstract. But they were looking at Wormian, Wormian? I don't know how to pronounce that because that's not the word I use, but which is also known as intrasutural or sutural bones. So these are little bits of bone that form between the sutures in your skull. I most commonly seen them between the occipital, which is the bone at the back, and the two parietal bones. So there's a suture. If you're watching the video, this might be helpful. There's a suture that sort of goes around the back of your head like this, on either side. And sometimes you can get just little extra bits of bone that end up growing there. They don't do anything. They don't really mean anything. They're a non-metric trait. Usually if someone has them, we note them and that's about it. They can be associated with some genetic conditions that affect bone, but they also just occur in the general population as well. But this study was kind of looking to see what the prevalence for them was in the catacombs individuals. They examined 500 skulls and found that 85% of them had these intrasutural or sutural bones, and apparently the normal amount to have based on other published studies is 10 to 20%, so they're seeing a much higher percentage in this. Again, I can only read the abstract, so I don't know what that means, but I just thought it was interesting to point out yet again another study being done on the skulls of the catacomb, because based on my understanding and kind of our current understandings of osteology, the skulls are probably the ones that are the most useful for studying. I'm sure you can do something with the femurs and the tibias and all the other broken bits of bones that are behind it, but the skulls, especially if they have to remain in situ when you're studying them, are probably the most useful ones at the moment to be doing studies on. But seeing as they're taking down these sort of structural walls at the moment for repairs, it's possible that they're able to do stuff with the other bones or get to the bones behind the walls as well. Obviously, the bones behind the walls have been subjected to less attention or damage, maybe, or potential damage from the people just walking through the catacombs as well. So maybe they're in better condition. Who knows? Anyway, so one of the other things I wanted to mention slightly about the catacombs just at the end of this is always when there's human remains on display, there are questions of ethics. And I think in the case of the catacombs, it's particularly interesting because these individuals were removed from their graves, but they were also legally removed from their graves because there was an overpopulation problem. And in a sense, they almost would have been worse off in their graves because of the numerous issues that were going on at the cemetery and with the whole city collapsing at the same time. So morally, removing them from their graves is like even more of a gray area, because it's like, it's not like it's like legal grave robbing. Like they needed to rob the graves. The graves were not sufficient anymore. But at the same time, these people did not consent to being moved or being made into walls. I don't know. But also, yeah, it's a very interesting one, because it's not like our episode on resurrectionists and gravediggers, where they were taking bodies to be studied for anatomy, and then their bodies were ending up on displays and still are on displays in museums, and there are huge ethical issues and concerns surrounding that are still up for debate today. These are like, they kind of had to be moved, these people. And like, they've been on display almost since they've been moved. They were never kept in a dark, shadowy corner and hidden away because it was, wrong. I mean, possibly wrong what they were doing, but you know what I mean. It was never a dark secret what was happening. It was all very out in the open what was happening. So it is an interesting ethical conundrum. One of the things I don't agree with the Catacombs is people writing on the bones. Guys, come on. Like, that's just people. Just people sometimes. I don't know. All the people I was in the Catacombs with seemed very respectful, even the children that were there. Okay, to be fair, some of the kids kept asking their parents if they could touch their bones, but the parents kept saying no, and like, kids don't know any better. That's fine. I get that. Also, props to the parents who are taking their kids to the Catacombs. You're cool. That's the kind of parent I would be. Yeah, that's the kind of aunt I would be. I would definitely take my nieces and nephews to the Catacombs. But yeah, so all the tourists or the other people who were in the tour with me were very respectful. They were very open to learning. They were talking to each other about these things, which is one of the things that was always wanted or sort of encouraged about the Catacombs, was to kind of acknowledge death. It's a memento mori, a reminder that we will die, and they want people to face this, to acknowledge this, to question it, to have discussions about it. Like, that was the whole point from when they initially opened the Catacombs to now, is to kind of have a conversation about death and think about it. So that was great. It's just the people who write on the bones I can't stand. But everyone who was in my group was great. So I just think it's really interesting how what began as quarries mined to build homes for the living became tunnels that were home to the dead. It's kind of a circle of life sort of way, if you think about it, how they mined out these tunnels and then filled them with the dead to kind of help with the collapsing city problem. I don't know. I just find it all really interesting and fascinating, I guess. Those are the words of the podcast. I can't think of better ones to use. It's interesting and fascinating, okay? But it is kind of thought-provoking as well to just think about this, I don't know, sort of circle of life thing, where it's like, I take from here to build homes for the living, and then when the living dies, you go back and you fill up the hole that I built. I don't know. I think it's kind of cool how that works. But anyway, that is episode 9 of the Resurrectionist podcast, The Catacombs of Paris. I'd be very interested to see what you guys think, especially surrounding that kind of ethical question of, should they be on display? It seems so different to me than when remains are on display in museums. Again, it's the same thing of, these individuals did not consent to this happening to them. But it's different in the sense of, like, it wasn't really meant to be jarring or a curiosity or like a morbid fascination thing. It was a solution to a pretty bad problem that the city was having, 2 pretty bad problems that the city was having. And it was a creative solution and it worked. So yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting, and I'd be really interested to see what you guys think about that as well. Reminder, I am taking questions for the Q&A at the end of this season, and I feel like questions around this one would be particularly interesting. I don't have answers to anything regarding the ethics and stuff around this, but I'll take questions nonetheless. So thank you all for listening. I will see you all in next week's, the final episode of season 1 of the Resurrectionist podcast. Bye, guys.